June 1941 was supposed to be the moment everything finally made sense. For years, Hitler's inner circle had listened to him warn that Germany's future depended on the East. Living space, resources, the final showdown with Bolshevism. Operation Barbarossa wasn't sold as a gamble. It was sold as destiny. A short, decisive campaign. 3 army groups, a few months. One final push, and the Soviet system would fold in on itself. At first it looked like he was right. Reports poured into the Wolf's Lair describing entire Soviet formations collapsing, roads jammed with abandoned equipment, prisoners taken faster than camps could be built. Field commanders spoke confidently, briefings were optimistic. Even the generals who'd privately feared the scale of the operation began to relax. But inside that same inner circle, something quieter was happening. Doubt didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as unease, as questions that went unanswered, as maps that stopped matching reality. By late summer, the language began to shift. At headquarters, Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, sat hunched over his maps, making notes that never made it into public announcements. Distances were being underestimated. Fuel consumption was exceeding projections. Units were reporting enemy formations that had supposedly already been destroyed. Halder's diary began to reflect something no one dared say aloud. This was not unfolding like France. Generals gathered around tables cluttered with aerial photos and weather reports. When commanders spoke about mopping up, their voices lacked conviction. Each pocket closed in the west seemed to open a larger one further east. The Red Army wasn't collapsing, it was retreating, reorganizing and reappearing where it shouldn't have been able to. Hitler dismissed early concerns with irritation. He claimed Soviet resistance was stiffening only because its leaders were panicking. In his mind, the enemy had already lost. What remained was cleanup. But beneath him, the tone changed. One officer described the war in the East as an advancing front with no rear. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, vulnerable and thin. Railways couldn't be converted fast enough. Trucks broke down. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Ammunition arrived late. Food arrived late. Winter clothing wasn't planned for at all. When generals raised these issues, they weren't accusing anyone. They were stating physical realities. Hitler heard excuses. The first real crack came when Moscow didn't fall. By September, voices inside the inner circle grew sharper. Walter von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, began pressing harder for operational flexibility. He wanted localized withdrawals, pauses, regrouping. He wanted choices. Hitler saw hesitation. In meetings, he began cutting people off mid-sentence. When officers spoke about Soviet counter-pressure, he insisted it was exaggerated. He claimed intelligence underestimated German success because it couldn't believe what had already been achieved. But those sitting around the table weren't convinced by speeches anymore. They were convinced by casualty lists. The numbers no longer matched the narrative. Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most respected commanders, privately acknowledged that Soviet resilience had been dangerously misread. He didn't say Barbarossa was failing, but he admitted it was becoming something entirely different than promised. Instead of a swift knockout, it was becoming a grinding, open-ended struggle across impossible distances. Inside the OKH, whispers grew darker. Junior staff officers overheard fragments of conversation late at night. Maps were adjusted, then adjusted again. Arrows pointing east grew shorter. Red ink representing enemy strength kept expanding. One officer later recalled that for the first time the phrase, "we may not be able to finish this," was spoken openly, then quickly walked back. As autumn turned to mud, the situation worsened. Vehicles sank into roads that barely existed. Artillery moved inches at a time. Orders issued in Berlin arrived too late to matter. Reports arriving from the front spoke less of victories and more of survival. The inner circle no longer talked about collapse. They talked about endurance. Hitler, meanwhile, doubled down. He refused withdrawals. He rejected strategic retreats. He insisted that German willpower could override geography, logistics, and weather. Anyone suggesting otherwise was weak, defeatist, or secretly disloyal. This was the moment many inside his circle began to realize something far more dangerous than military failure. They were no longer fighting the Soviets alone. They were fighting Hitler's certainty. During heated briefings, generals tried carefully chosen words. They spoke of temporary adjustments, of elastic defense, of operational pauses. Each phrase was designed to avoid provoking him. It didn't help. Hitler interrupted constantly. He accused commanders of lacking ideological commitment. He questioned their courage. He reminded them that Germany had overcome greater odds before. Privately, officers exchanged looks of quiet alarm, because the Eastern Front did not behave like the wars Hitler remembered. When winter arrived early, reality finally intruded into even the most loyal minds. Units without winter gear froze where they stood. Weapons malfunctioned, vehicles failed. Entire operations stalled simply because movement became impossible. At headquarters, daily situation reports grew grim. One officer remarked that the war had begun consuming Germany faster than it consumed the enemy. Hitler blamed generals. Generals blamed planning assumptions no one was allowed to revisit. Inside the inner circle, fractures deepened. Brauchitsch, physically exhausted and mentally defeated, began withdrawing from real influence. Halder's diary grew increasingly pessimistic, but still cautious. Manstein focused on saving what could still be saved at the operational level, often improvising without Berlin's blessing. And Hitler, he became more isolated. He surrounded himself with yes-men, sidelined dissenters, and trusted his intuition over data. The inner circle shrank, not because fewer people were involved, but because fewer people were listened to. By early 1942, Barbarossa was no longer discussed as a campaign with an endpoint. It was spoken of as a condition. This is no longer a war of movement, one officer admitted. It is a test of who collapses first. That sentence haunted many of them, because the frightening realization was this: the Soviet system hadn't broken under pressure. It had adapted. Industry was shifting east. New formations kept appearing. Morale didn't collapse the way German planners had predicted. Someone in the inner circle quietly asked a forbidden question. What if the assumptions were wrong? No one answered it publicly. To do so would mean admitting that the entire ideological foundation of the war was flawed, that years of preparation were built on false certainty, that Germany had marched into a fight it could not dictate. Instead, they pressed forward. As 1942 unfolded, the inner circle's tone hardened into grim determination. Confidence had vanished, replaced by obligation. Officers didn't speak of victory anymore. They spoke of preventing disaster, and slowly the understanding settled in. Barbarossa hadn't failed in a single moment. It failed the instant it assumed the enemy would collapse, simply because Germany wanted it to. By the time that truth became undeniable, retreat was no longer an option. Germany was trapped in a war of scale, weather, manpower, and time, all of which now favored its enemy. Inside Hitler's inner circle, many knew it. Almost none could stop it. And by the time the full consequences became clear, Barbarossa had already transformed from a bold gamble into the beginning of Germany's irreversible decline. If you made it this far, make sure to subscribe for more deep-dive World War II stories like this one. Drop a like if this video gave you a new perspective, and let me know in the comments what part of the war you want covered next.